would you like to live forever? I mean, really, many of us would probably say, yeah, okay, I'd give it a go. But what happens to our housing, the idea of marriage, our jobs, the way we fill our time, and even the way that society as a whole is structured? And then what happens if living forever is only available to a select few people? Well, I'm talking to a Cambridge professor about if living forever is actually good for us and how we go about living forever if we decide that that's what we want to do. So check it out. On the face of it, living forever might sound wonderful, but is it actually something we should strive for, or will it bring untold misery? To help me unpack this is Professor Stephen Cave of the University of Cambridge. So if you wouldn't mind please introducing yourself, talk a little bit about some of the work that you do, and then we can talk about the quest for immortality.
Yep. Hi, Sean. Thanks for having me. So I'm a philosopher at the University of Cambridge, where I direct something called the Institute for Technology and Humanity, where we think very broadly about how to make technological transformation go well, including things like AI, that are the hot topics these days, and life extension. Is it possible, and what would it mean? And that's something I've written a couple of books on over the years, whether we should want to live forever and whether we can live forever.
Well, that feels like a good place to start, and almost in aid of making this conversation not feel redundant. It would be good to start with, can we live forever? How might we live forever? And so I suppose there are sort of medical ways defeating aging, sort of tampering with cells. There's been a long field of freezing people in hopes that they might be revived one day, and then obviously there are digital ways of potentially making us immortal as well. So if you could talk a little bit about all of those and any others that you can think of.
Yeah, so there's lots of excitement at the moment that we are on the verge of a breakthrough in life extension, and we might soon be able to defeat aging and disease for good. But it's worth bearing in mind that people have been thinking we're on the verge of a breakthrough for something around 5,000 years. That is, for all of recorded human history. People seem to have believed they were on the verge of a breakthrough in life extension. The Egyptians very much thought so. You know, for them, mummification was plan B, and they were developing elixirs, and you can find papyruses that talk about how to live forever. We find the same beliefs in ancient China. The first emperor of China, who united that great country for the first time, also then invested all of the resources of his huge empire in living forever. And the history of science is also replete with people who believed that, you know, hormones or vitamins or whatever the latest new discovery was would help us finally crack aging and disease. So we've been standing on this verge for a long time, which is not good for my arthritis. We've heard it all before, but at the same time, there are reasons to be distinctively optimistic now. And I think those reasons are that for the first time, we really do have a deep understanding of how our body works. We've mapped the human genome. We understand, the biochemistry of our bodies in ways that no civilization has in the past. And perhaps the most important proof of this is that we can extend the lifespans of other organisms, other species in the lab. So this isn't just wishful thinking anymore. With very simple organisms like nematodes, these tiny, tiny worms, which are very simple compared to humans, very few cells compared to our billions of cells. Nematodes, it's possible scientists can extend their lifespans tenfold. And with more complex animals like mammals, our fellow mammals, dogs and monkeys, mice, of course, as I'm sure you know, lots of experiments happen on mice because they breed very quickly and so on, and they're very well understood. Their lifespans can be extended by up to 30% with some regularity, and people are hoping soon to be able to double the lifespan of mice. So these are proofs of concept. And if you think that, extending, a 30% increase in life expectancy is not living forever. But for humans living to 80 or so, that would still be huge. That would mean the average life expectancy was over 100. So that would be a big revolution. And people hope that would be just the next step. If we were living longer, then we'd still be around when the next breakthrough happened. And then that would allow us to live long enough for when the next breakthrough happened. And so we'd reach this longevity takeoff velocity.
So there's almost a cut-off point that we're, I guess, all hoping to reach. Although I suppose maybe through the course of this conversation, we might not be hoping for it by the end. I don't know. But there will be a point where you can just sort of keep cycling through these processes once we hit scientific milestones.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a lot of excitement about various interventions that are underway right now. a lot of new technologies coming onto the market, including, of course, AI, which everyone's talking about, which people hope will accelerate drug discovery and our understanding of our body and help us personalize medicine and so on. So a lot of excitement.
And then cryonics, freezing people. I mean, I feel like we've just been hearing about it for decades. But is that a realistic approach, or is it still sort of in the realms of science fiction as to whether it might work?
As a movement, it developed last century and around the 1970s, when people in California, obviously, was the beating heart of all of this life extension. Aldous Huxley, the great writer who wrote Brave New World and so on, was satirizing the life extension movement in California 100 years ago. So this is not a new phenomenon. But anyway, cryonics as a movement emerged because people were worried that they might not make it for the great breakthroughs in life expectancy. And so they needed what they called an ambulance into the future. That is a way of putting us in a kind of suspended animation so that we could be revived when science and technology are much more advanced. And that suspended animation happened through freezing. I mean, we know if we freeze things, then we can preserve them for much longer. So cryonics is the idea that you freeze your entire body if you've got enough money. And if you don't, you can take the cheaper option and just freeze your head. And then you hope that in the future, scientists will work out how you can be defrosted and brought back to life, and presumably a new and better robot body built for you.
Of course, I suppose you're taking a gamble that the sort of new world will be better. You're not waking up to a sort of dystopia of unimaginable horrors.
Well, indeed, or if it's utopia. I mean, imagine we created paradise and we had all these corpses in the freezer. I mean, we're thinking, do we want to revive those? We've got it pretty good here. Why would we want to share this? So it's decidedly risky. It's risky for lots of reasons. It's risky because, as you say, we don't know what the future will be like. We don't know if anyone's going to want to thaw us out and revive us. We don't know if we'd like it if they did. But not only that, but at the moment, the process of freezing someone is extremely fatal. Like, it's really, really bad for you. Not just because it's illegal to do unless someone's anyway already dead. So, something pretty bad has to have happened to you for it to be legal for you to be frozen. Like, I can't just go and freeze you now, sure, no matter how, much you beg me to do so, because that would be murder. But also the process of freezing is itself very bad for our body. It does all sorts. So when this happens, first the body has to be flooded with a kind of antifreeze to stop all the cells exploding. Like liquids expand when frozen, so all your cells would explode unless you're flooded with antifreeze, which is itself poisonous. So like every bit of this is bad. So it's a really, really desperate measure. But the people who sign up for it say, okay, it's really implausible, it's really unlikely, but, being cremated, it's even less likely you're going to be brought back. So, my odds are slightly better.
And then I suppose there's digital immortality, which you could, it's in very early stages, but you could technically do to me without my permission, unlike freezing me. I mean, I know I've talked on previous episodes about grief bots of people turning dead relatives into AI chatbots based on previous chat histories. Sometimes they have sort of avatars that are based on their faces. I suppose we're not at the point where they are sentient and have their own sort of feelings, and I suppose it's not a true clone of you, but it's not necessarily unimaginable that we'll get closer to that point in the future.
Well, indeed. And what's imaginable is changing very rapidly. And when I started writing about this 20 years ago, it really was a far future fantasy. And now, as you say, people are doing this. And with the breakthrough in LLMs, these large language models like ChatGPT and Claude and so on, we can have very realistic personas to interact with. And so all you need to do is tweak one of these personas to be more like, me or you or your, beloved deceased granddad or grandma, whoever it might be. And it very much seems like these people are coming back. I mean, maybe right now you're not talking to maybe the real me is having a nap and you're talking to my avatar right now. And, it's one thing to believe you can bring back a kind of avatar of someone to help you with your grief that might feel, better to interact with that than nothing at all. But the real believers hope that this can become genuine survival. But this isn't just like a simulacrum of me, a copy of me of some kind. But actually, if it has all of my memories and beliefs and hopes and dreams, then that will be the real me. And so this seems like, in some ways, a more dependable version of immortality, because bodies are so unreliable. I could get hit by a bus, this afternoon. But if I backed myself up this morning, then I don't have anything to worry about. So the optimists believe. I myself am skeptical.
And then I suppose we have these sort of less tangible ideas of immortality, which may be a sort of, I suppose, the legacy you leave behind, or lots of people obviously through religion believe that there is an afterlife, which might be somewhere very nice, or it might be just sort of being reincarnated and living in different forms on Earth. So lots of different ideas there. I suppose it's hard to quantify because we have no way of measuring what that afterlife might be like, should it exist. But I suppose some of the ideas around immortality would still apply to that, of whether it would actually be nice to live forever. Lots of people hope that it would be nice to live forever in an afterlife, certainly.
Yeah, that's right. Probably still the majority of people on the planet do believe that they have a soul and that it will outlive the body. It's central to Christianity these days. It wasn't originally. Christianity was very much based around bodily resurrection, like, following the example of Jesus. But now most Christians believe in a soul. Muslims too, Hindus, of course, and Buddhists, it's a bit more complicated, but something like that. They still believe in something like reincarnation. And various traditional belief systems, various New Age belief systems. So it's a very popular view still. And it is a very attractive way of coping with the fear of death, but it's difficult to imagine what a happy ever after would look like. And of course, people have tried through the ages to imagine paradise and what that could mean. And it might start out with something quite physical. In Islam, is this idea of the garden, where of course Islam comes from desert lands, and their idea of heaven was one flowing with milk and honey and rivers of wine and great comfort and sort of nice fluffy cushions and sort of everything that makes life easy and pleasant if you're otherwise living a harsh nomadic desert life. And similarly, preachers through the ages have tried to mobilize the idea of a wonderfully attractive heaven where you sort of get to meet your beloved granddad and so on. But these don't stand up to much scrutiny. I mean, what if my granddad would rather be playing poker with his friends? It's hard to imagine an immortality that keeps everyone happy. And the theologians, rather than the preachers, of course, and of course Jesus himself in the Bible know this very well, and are a bit more evasive. It's like, oh, well, it would be more like the life of angels. It won't be like human life. Or in the Bible, in the book of Revelations, we'll be standing around the throne of God singing hosannas for eternity. And it might not sound like fun, but we're told, no, it just is. Like, it just will be blissful. It's hard for our limited brains, I think, to really imagine an eternity of happiness.
Well, this feels like a good point to move on to whether our minds and the human psyche is actually well suited to living forever. My grandmother's in her 90s, and whenever I'm like, oh, you could live till 100, 110, 120, she always says, well, I hope not. I would love not to. And some of that was certainly be linked to health span and how well she feels. And I'm sure if you speak to a lot of 100-year-olds who don't feel particularly well, they would say, well, I wouldn't like to go on for much longer. But maybe that answer would change if they felt very well for the full extent of their life. And so I suppose it is the human mind, does it have a willingness and a capacity to go on? And where do you find meaning? Would it just be tremendously boring once you've done 2 or 3 human lifetimes and then you feel like you've done everything?
Yeah, these are great questions. It's very interesting that when surveyed, people often say they don't want to live forever, or even particularly to an old age, even to 100 or 120 or whatnot. But at the same time, if you ask them, well, do you want to die this afternoon or tomorrow? Then they would say no. Well, if you don't ever want to die tomorrow, you end up living forever. But it's interesting that we imagine living longer as being problematic, as being fraught with troubles. And I think there are a few reasons for this. One you mentioned, which is health span. So, of course, as people get older, then they feel more tired, have more things wrong with them, more aches and pains, and life just starts to feel, wearisome. But, of course, the optimists believe that we can tackle that and we can stay well and feel young for longer. So imagine that's true. Imagine we've solved that problem. I think the next problem is actually our social perceptions. I think, to talk of your grandmother, I don't know her. I hope she is part of a thriving community and family and so on. But as a society, we're not very good at integrating our older people, at least compared to traditional ways of life. Our hunter-gatherer forebears and hunter-gatherers who still exist today, grandmothers and great-grandmothers and great-great-grandmothers are very active in babysitting, and they contribute to the survival of the children. That is to say, mothers whose own mothers are still alive have more children who survive their infancy. So, for example, there you go, there's a fact. So, older people play important roles. And same with grandfathers. They play important roles in passing on wisdom as chieftains, as storytellers, making tools that are crucial to survival and so on. So traditionally, at older ages, we've been essential members of the community. And we've changed that with the idea of, well, there's a period in which you work and then there's a period in which you retire and you can go off and do what you like, but you're not really relevant anymore. And this is very bad for people's mental health and people's sense of, as you say, meaning in life. Sometimes we think of meaning in life as being very much an individual challenge. We each have to find our own calling, but it's actually very, very social. Most of the meaning that we feel in life comes from the communities we belong to, the activities that we're engaged in, whether it's a local charity or a team, or of course a job and paid work or, activism in the community, that kind of thing. So if we're going to make a success of longer lives, then because we're such social beings and we want to be useful, that we're going to need to change not just our bodies, but also our whole social structures in order to ensure people do feel that their lives are meaningful.
And of course, you would need access to the immortality to be fairly democratized. Otherwise, I imagine people wouldn't want to do it. Like in the cryonics example, if I became tremendously wealthy and was able to afford to freeze myself and come back in 500 years, I wouldn't particularly want to do that unless I could guarantee that the same thing was true for my friends and family. And you imagine it would be quite lonely. And then I suppose linking to that in the idea of relationships, I feel like it would be difficult for relationships as they are today to survive because, some people struggle to stay married for even a few years. So the idea of committing to, I want to be with this person for the next 1,000 years, I feel like that's not, maybe some relationships, I would like to think that I could be with my wife for 1,000 years and more. But, certainly some people would say, well, it's just unsustainable to have relationships in the same way anymore if you could live forever.
Yeah, absolutely. There is such a thing as a natural human lifespan, which is around 70 years, like it says in the Bible, 70 years and 10. And all our social institutions, like marriage, are based on that assumption. But, even that might seem like too long for some people. I speak as a divorced person. But, until about 100 years ago, the chance of someone dropping dead at any age was much higher. And of course, women in childbirth and so on. So indeed, when signing up to marriage, you might have been signing up to, a few years or a few decades, but definitely not centuries, which is the prospect we might face if we generally do master our bodies. But already some people, cultures are experimenting with other forms of union. We could just abandon these things like marriage altogether. People can hang out together for as long as they want and then they can do something else. But equally, if we do want something more contractual, more committed, we could time limit it. We could have 20-year marriages, and at the end, people have a review and decide whether to renew, and if so, whether on a sort of annual rolling basis or go for a full extra 20 years. I think our social institutions haven't changed that much for as far back as we can see, because our conception of the human, even though many more people are living now to sort of like the full human lifespan of 70 or 80 years, still we can see that 70 or 80 years is something like the natural human lifespan we see throughout history. So it's stayed relatively unchanged. So if people now start living to 120, 140, 150, that would, for the first time in history, be a radical break with a conception of a natural human lifespan. So I think naturally a lot of our social institutions would have to change.
I would love to know if there is any science around this at all, but this idea of memory, and if memory can sustain for such long amounts of time. And I don't even particularly know how it would be testable, but if you could live for 500, 5,000, 50,000 years, how much memory can the brain store? And, would there be certain points where you just start forgetting entire sort of human lifespans that I've forgotten the first 150 years of my life because my brain simply can't hold on to that much memory. I don't know where we max out.
I feel like I have. I have to say the 1970s are pretty vague for me. Not for the reason the 1970s are vague for some people. But I was born in 1973 and I just have a memory of brown flares and yellow curtains. That's it, really. The 80s are a little bit clearer. But, naturally, there is something like a limit because there's just a limit to how, our brains do have a hard limit, even though, they're unbelievably complex and we can keep laying down new memories. But, still there is a limit. So life would be very different. I mean, if we're really imagining someone who's thousands of years old, then I think their sense of what they were doing, in millennia past would be very, very vague indeed. But, perhaps we'd develop new prostheses, if you like, new tools to manage this, just like we have photo albums now and keep diaries and journals and, we can look back and they jog our memories. And, if we're living in such a technologically advanced world that we have mastered aging and disease and are living to 2000, then I'm sure we could also just sort of plug in a hard drive and like download some memories, upload some other ones.
It would almost be like a history lesson for you. So you'd sort of have your own archive, and it'd be like going back to read about Napoleon. It's like, what was I doing in the year 1832? And you could go back and check. I mean, I suppose we document so much of our lives now anyway that we effectively are sort of archiving memories, but it's sort of interesting to think of having to be a sort of historian for your own mind.
Yeah. I mean, if we're really imagining technology so sophisticated, we're living with thousands of years, then maybe we genuinely could go back and, put on VR, virtual reality glasses and relive these moments. I mean, as you say, we generate so much data about our lives now. And we could probably pop back and forth in high definition.
So we've talked a little bit about how society would need to adapt in terms of relationships. I think the idea of wealth is interesting, related to immortality in two ways. I think the idea that potentially this could only be accessible to rich people, and does that sort of then, carve society in two, where you have sort of like elite that lives forever, and then sort of the rest of us. I would like to be in the, or maybe not, I don't know. It would be nice to be in the sort of group that had access to that. But, would it split society in two? And then also, we've certainly seen wealth inequality grow over time. And you can imagine that not changing if we live forever. And so would those sorts of problems maybe become more entrenched in society because it's just allowed to go on and on and on?
I think it's very likely they would. I think the lessons of history cut both ways. On the one hand, paracetamol's cheap. Certainly in this country, in the UK, everyone can access it. Antibiotics, absolute lifesavers, really transformed civilization. Everyone can access those now. We've got, anyone, the poorest person in this country can access healthcare that a king a few hundred years ago would not have been able to access. So it's true that there is a very significant trickle-down effect, that, we do learn how to mass produce these interventions, and we have a welfare state that functions well enough to make them broadly accessible. That's the good news. The bad news is that a lot of these interventions that are currently being tried out are extremely expensive. And even if the interventions were made broadly available, there are subtle ways in which wealth leads to better lives, better health, better outcomes. And, now we can read with some regularity that there are discrepancies of 10 years or more between rich and poor, or north and south, or different ethnic groups in this country. And when we read about these 10-year differences, we naturally think it's an outrage. So imagine instead if it's, 100 or 200-year differences, then I think as a society would find that unacceptable.
And I think in terms of even governing the country, I mean, we certainly have a problem in the UK at the moment where politics feels very short-termist. I mean, it's 7 prime ministers now in 10 years. It feels very difficult to get any long-term projects done. In the instance where we're all living forever, I don't know whether it would help sort of concentrate the mind for politicians and public on long-term thinking, or would it just sort of lead to a situation where you just end up with sort of like tyrants who just manage to hold on for power for a very long time and then don't have to do much to improve society. I'd be interested to see how it would change.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be nice to think that we'd all become wiser and more longer term in our thinking. The evidence for that's not great, you know. I mean, right now, you know, I mean, climate, we've just had, what, 2 heat waves in June already. And how hard are we working to tackle climate change, even though it will affect the lives of you know, people who have already been born, who are already alive today, not to mention my children. I mean, the idea that I would care if I was living longer, but not because I have children. It's a bit like, well, yeah, I'm not sitting there thinking, well, sod them. They can deal with the crap I've left. I mean, I want a better world already for them, just as much as I would, I think, if I was living longer. And yet still we fail to take the short-term decisions and make the short-term sacrifices that we need for things to go well in the longer term. So maybe it would improve, but I don't know. I'm a little skeptical about human nature in that regard. But I think you're absolutely right about the risk of tyrants. I mean, we are seeing how, I mean, money accumulates money. That's how capitalism works. And power tends to accumulate power. You know, we can see that with some rulers today, like Vladimir Putin, for example. And, you know, you might remember, was it last year already? I know recently there was a summit between Russia and China in Beijing. Vladimir Putin was speaking to the Chinese president, and there was a hot mic moment where it wasn't supposed to be recorded, but they were just idly chatting to each other about their favorite immortality therapies. So, you know, is that the world we want? Because it might be where we're headed.
And then, oh God, I hope not. I was thinking about how we house all of the people, because I mean, already we struggle to sort of build adequate housing for the population. And, you know, if no one is dying and not, you know, not freeing up those houses, that becomes a problem. But then even just supporting people, you know, what happens to retirement? Do people just do a career and then a new career and then a new career and there is no retirement? Or do humans need to retire for their own sanity? And but then how do you pay for that? And how do you set up a pension system to manage when people are living forever? And when does it cut off? And when does it begin? You know, it's so complex, and it feels like we haven't really solved, I would say, housing and retirement for our current lifespans. So the idea of having to do it for immortality feels improbable.
Yeah, there are a lot of big questions. And overpopulation, you can see, as in some ways the flip side of the injustice question. Because if the interventions of the life extension technologies are available to just a few people, then it would seem very unjust. But if they're available to everyone, then suddenly we have an overpopulation problem. Now, I mean, the overpopulation problem is complex because the so-called carrying capacity of the planet, that is the number of humans it can support, is not stable. You know, Thomas Malthus was predicting a population crisis a few hundred years ago, and he was, broadly speaking, wrong, because technological transformation allowed us to support more people. You know, there are 8 billion people alive today. 100 years ago, about 2 billion. 200 years ago, about 1 billion. So huge increase in population. There are fewer people living in poverty now, absolute numbers, not as a proportion, than there were 100 years ago or 200 years ago. So, you know, incredible revolutions in our ability to grow and distribute food largely, and have enabled the planet to support more humans. At least, well, some would say the jury's still out. We're destroying biodiversity, global warming, and so on. But, you know, there are more people alive than ever before today, and they're better off as well. So the optimists say, with amazing new technologies like AI, we'll be able to continue to increase the carrying capacity of the planet, and we'll explore new planets. And of course, it's some of the same billionaires who are investing large sums in life extension technologies who are investing in, you know, exploring Mars and settling other planets. So that's what the optimists say. I think the pessimists would say that, well, we are already destroying the planet, even if we're keeping humans alive. We're doing it at great expense, and we don't know how sustainable that is. And other planets is a bit of a fantasy, because, you know, the least hospitable part of Earth, like the top of Mount Everest or the bottom of the deepest part of the ocean, is way more hospitable than Mars. Right? I mean, we have to be realistic about this. You know, water and oxygen are kind of key to human life. So maybe all this is a fantasy. So I think overpopulation is something we'd have to very seriously think about. But at the same time, some people think we're having a population crisis because population is about to plummet. So, you know, these are complicated matters. But I do agree that, you know, given we might be on the verge of a breakthrough in life extension, we're not giving us enough serious thought to how we would manage it.
And then in terms of the how we change in the long term, I was thinking this the other day, and I often think about this when I think about immortality, is Lord of the Rings, because you obviously have the elves who can live forever, thousands and thousands of years. And it always strikes me when they go to war in the books and in the movies, and they die. For some reason, it feels so much more tragic, and I can't conceive of why they would do it. Relative to a human who has a normal human lifespan, even though in a way that is more precious because it's a shorter lifespan, there's something about the idea that I would go on for 3,000 or 4,000 years, but a freak accident could kill me. It makes me feel as though I would then want to be more cautious. And then the idea of going to war and taking an even bigger chance feels more tragic.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you could think of life, we often talk of life in terms of how many years you've lived already. It's like, oh, I've been on the planet for 53 years. But you could instead think of it as the opposite, like how many years you've got left. And that's obviously you can't know for sure, but you can think about what average life expectancy is and then tweak it according to, whether you smoke or not, whether you do exercise or not, and so on. And so you can say, well, I've got 30 years left. And so if I, get hit by a bus today, then 30 years are lost. And of course, if someone's a teenager and they die in a car crash, then 70 years are lost. And that's a lot more years. So that's a much higher price to pay. And I think that is and we do intuitively feel like that. I think, as you were saying, when an older person dies, there are lots of reasons why we might be sad. But we don't think, oh, they had it all ahead of them. We don't. We say, oh, they had a good innings. So we do have this sense of, well, maybe if they'd survived that, they anyway would have, died from something else fairly soon. So I think, that intuition that you have, and I think many people share, is about the years that are lost. And that's a very reasonable way to look at risk. And so if we could live for thousands of years, then indeed the idea of going to war as a 20-year-old, which is a perfectly typical time for someone to be a soldier, does seem like madness because what they stand to lose is so enormous. But that assumes that people are making these kind of risk calculations rationally. And we don't have a great history of making any decisions rationally, really, but certainly not those kind. I mean, the riskiest members of our population are, young men, between the age of about 15 and 25, who have got loads to lose. So it seems there's something ingrained in us that makes us engage in that kind of risky behavior at that age. But at the same time, I think socially we would become more conservative, as we already have. I mean, that's the lesson of history. A few hundred years ago, there wasn't much by way of health and safety regulations. Because, it's just like, yeah, life's crappy. It's full of dangers. You're probably going to die at some point really soon. God knows what of, but there are a lot of different candidates. So, what's the point of, I'm sure people maybe looked at carriages before they crossed the road, but otherwise it just wasn't worth going to elaborate lengths to take precautions. And the longer we live, the lesson of the 19th, 20th, 21st centuries, the more precautions we do take and the more cautious we become. So I'm sure that would continue. And maybe eventually it would get too much. Some people think it's already gotten too much, right? And we need a certain amount of risk and excitement to lead a full life.
I can't help but feel that if we could live for thousands of years, extreme sports would become increasingly untenable, because the idea of doing that and something going wrong, I think it would probably be bad news for Red Bull as a company. I don't know. Religion, I think, is another interesting point, because many religions are based on this idea of an afterlife, this promise of an afterlife. If you behave well in life, then you have this wonderful place that you can go to after. But if that afterlife is potentially thousands of years away, or potentially never, because you just go on and on and on, does religion sort of become redundant to society, or does it still have a part to play? Because a lot of it is hinged on this idea that there is a reward for being good in life.
Well, there's a pretty close correlation between rise in science and technology and decrease in belief in religion. And so, it's not uniform. For example, the US is a bit of an outlier, for example, in having, very sophisticated science technology and high levels of religiosity. But in most parts of the world and over history of the last few hundred years, as a rule, as science and technology has become more widespread as a belief system, if you like, religion has declined. And to an extent, that's not because, science has refuted God or what have you, but because they play similar roles in people's lives. So, people might pray to get better. Well, instead you can go to the hospital. People might dream of living in a future paradise and, previously thought they'd have to die and go to heaven. And now, we're promised that AI and whatnot is going to create a paradise for us. And of course, one of the biggest questions that religion has always answered is what happens when we die? How do we deal with death? How do we face it? What happens next? Can we live forever? So increasingly, as science and technology offer answers to those questions, not always plausible answers, right? But people are using the language of science and technology to make these promises. Then that, I think, for many people will replace the promises made by religion.
We are still grappling with this politically now, but this idea of this, this right to die, it's obviously, still very controversial all around the world, even in the UK. This idea that if you have a, very serious illness that has significantly reduced your quality of life, the idea that you would be allowed to die, which, in some places is possible, in some places is not. I wonder if that whole concept changes if I can live for 3,000 years, or potentially more, should I have the right to sort of be able to retire from that life when I no longer want to do it because it goes on for so long? Or does it not change the argument at all? I don't know.
No, I think it does. I think that's such an interesting question. I think it does change the arguments in quite subtle ways. On the one hand, some people say, if you ask them, well, do you want to live forever or do you want to give it a go? Do you want to take this elixir, this life extension technology? And I would say, yeah, I'll give it a go, as long as I have a get out clause. I'll take it for 100 years and I'll see how that goes and I can choose whether to take it again. So what people are saying is that they want the choice to top themselves if they've had enough. They want euthanasia or what have you. And that seems very rational. But at the same time, as you're saying, it's very controversial. As a rule, we think people committing suicide is a very bad thing and that they'd have to be very desperate. And we're debating whether euthanasia should be allowed for people who are terminally ill only. So, who are really already on their way out. We're not offering it to everyone. We're not saying anyone who's just feels they've had enough can, take this way out. We would think, we're probably trying to argue with them that it'd be irrational, but actually they might be feeling low now, but things might turn around. Well, now imagine that you could live for thousands and thousands of years, and after the first 600, you've really had enough. You're in a real low. So you say, I don't want to do this anymore. Well, as a society, would we accept that? Or would we say, but you stand to lose thousands of years, and who knows what you'll think 300 years from now? It's like Marvin, the paranoid android in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I can't remember what exactly he said, but he's like, I've been, waiting here for 10 billion years. The first 5 million were the worst. It's like, maybe we get over the hump after the first 1,000 and then start living the dream. And it's very hard to know. So you'd be giving up a lot and with a lot of uncertainty about what the future holds. So people intuitively think, I'd take that if I had an exit clause. As a society, we might think, no, you can't have an exit clause. That would be just irrational.
I do like the idea of, you mentioned it with the marriage, 20-year check-ins, and then again, I like the idea of having regular check-ins to see if you still want to continue with life or maybe career or marriage. I feel like maybe that is getting closer to a solution, but I still don't know if it quite solves any of those problems. I wanted to ask you about whether living forever is something that we should strive for, whether it is something that would be good for humanity, and sort of your personal opinion on how you personally feel about it, whether you would like to live forever. But it reminded me of the tech industry and so much of science, actually, in that whether we will actually even have a choice as to whether we end up living forever, because so often with technological development, you end up in a kind of sort of arms race. And you could very easily see a sort of healthcare arms race where, well, if, one country is developing this technology to live forever, well, you can certainly imagine, well, then the USA needs to do it as well. And then, once we have the capacity to make people live forever, well, then it just will inevitably spread. And it's almost not a question of whether we should or shouldn't, because it will just happen even if everyone thinks that we shouldn't. So many technologies and terrible technologies have been developed just because they can, not necessarily because they should. And so I suppose two questions. Is it something that we should strive for? And will it happen anyway, even if society thinks we shouldn't?
Yeah, Yeah, good question. I'll take the second one first. So techno-determinism, that's this idea that technology has its own momentum. There's nothing we can do to stop it. It's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, yeah, there are some people who want it a lot. Those people have got a lot of money and feel history's on their side. And so, yes, things will happen. Does that mean we should just shrug our shoulders? No, I think I should be sacked from my job if I thought that. It's my job as an academic to think about how we can make technological transformation go well, which means I believe we can shape it and, if necessary, even stop it. Now, I'm not saying that's easy, but there are examples where we have banned technologies in the past. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of effort to prevent nuclear proliferation. Of course, there are some nuclear weapons. Biological and chemical weapons are strictly restricted, shall we say. I mean, research goes on in very controlled conditions. And of course, people violate these. These things are hard to enforce, but we can still see there are a lot fewer of these things around than there would be if we didn't try very hard to stop them. Same with illegal drugs. Whether you agree with which ones should or shouldn't be illegal, of course, there is a big underground market, but still there are probably fewer of these things around than there would otherwise be. So I think it's worth trying to control, and it's worth trying to shape. I mean, it's not always about banning or allowing a technology. We can choose whether to foster it or not, and then we can choose how to regulate it, and we can choose how as a society we adjust to the possibilities that a new technology offers. So I think it's really important that we don't just shrug our shoulders, but that we, all of us as a society, as citizens, think, well, if these technologies are around that are going to help us to live longer, then we should all get involved in thinking about what a vision of this going well looks like, what kind of society we want to have when they arrive. Should we want them? Should we want to live forever? So I don't think we can live forever. I mean, forever's a long time, right? A billion years would be a billionth of forever. So, forever's an unimaginably large time. I don't think that's what we're talking about. I mean, at some point the sun's going to swallow the earth, and the universe will collapse in on itself or something. So we're not talking about forever. And I think that's important. I'm not just being pedantic. I think it's important that we realize we are finite. We are going to die. I hope this isn't news to any of your listeners. We are going to die. And I think recognizing that's important to a life well lived. But that doesn't mean we have to accept things as they are. And we might decide, that we do want to live twice as long, that actually a good life, a rich and full life, can be one that's 150 years long. That could, at least for some people, be better than a life of 70 years. And, if as a society we think that, then we should go for it. But we should do it with our eyes open about the challenges and the opportunities and what our vision of this going well looks like.
So I sort of wonder whether we will then, through experimentation, find a kind of sweet spot for aging. But then again, I sort of come back to this sort of deterministic idea that, once we hit a milestone, it will then keep creeping up. Whether we don't, we get to 150 and we think, actually, now we can get to 180. And even if 150 transpires that is the sweet spot, it will still just creep up. But I suppose there must be a sweet spot. But then it might turn out that maybe just regular human lifespan is the sweet spot, and we just don't know how lucky we are.
Yeah. Was it Goethe, the German writer, who said a day is long if you know how to fill it? 80 years isn't so bad if you use it well. There are plenty of people right now who are depressed, bored, fed up, wasting their time. So we're not doing a great job of using our 70 or 80 years as well as we could. We should possibly prioritize that before we start thinking of doubling it. Otherwise, we'll just be sort of, doubling it so we can procrastinate and doom scroll even more. I think it's a Woody Allen joke that two old ladies in a resort, and one says, "The food here is terrible." And the other one says, "I know, and the portions are so small." It's like, why would you want bigger portions of terrible food? It's like, well, for a lot of people, life's like that already. Like, why would we want to live longer when already there are loads of people who are depressed and so on? So let's first make the life we have as good as it can be. And then if we think, my God, this is great, we want more of this, it's like, okay, then let's tackle that problem.
That feels like a very optimistic and positive place to end. So thank you for speaking to me.
Thank you, Sean. It's great to talk.